Yeah, it works.
Now lay before the mast all evening reports. Evening reports will be held online this evening. Aloha and good evening to supporters of the Coast Guard history, and welcome to this evening's edition of the Foundation for Coast Guard History's Evening Reports. For those who have not been to sea aboard a Coast Guard cutter, after sundown, evening reports are held so that the executive officer may be apprised of the day's activities. Armed with that knowledge, they can align those accomplishments to the next day's activities. In much the same way, we hope that by looking at the Coast Guard's past, it can be used as a guide for the future. Or as Captain Fred Hersberg, our founder, says, reflect on the past to illuminate the future. The Foundation for Coast Guard History is a nonprofit organization whose purpose is to promote the recognition and prestige of the United States Coast Guard by highlighting its past contributions to the nation and advancing public knowledge of the Coast Guard and her predecessor services. We are recording this event this evening. If you have any concerns regarding that, please drop off now. You can view the recording in its entirety once it's posted on our YouTube channel. I will have everyone on mute for the duration of the presentation. If you have a question, please use the chat box. With that, it is time to introduce our speaker this evening. Mark Mollan is the Deputy Historian for the United States Coast Guard. Mark earned his undergraduate degree at the University of Central Florida, then graduated with distinction from Villanova University with a master's in history. He worked at the National Archives for 15 years, which is where I first met him, and then at the Navy's History and Heritage Command before assuming his duties as Deputy Historian in 2021. Now at tonight's presentation, here's Mark. All right, Mark, we'll go ahead and let you start sharing your screen.
Well, thank you, everybody. I know you're all very busy and appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to join us this evening. I also want to thank Gary for inviting me to be here tonight. And so thank you all very much. And I also want to thank the Coast Guard historian, Scott Price, for encouraging me to joining you this evening. So thank you all. And let me go ahead and share my screen. I've got a bit of a PowerPoint presentation to start off with, discussing a bit of research and a little bit of background about the National Archives. And I thought I'd kind of go through the PowerPoint rather quickly so we can get to any questions and Q&A at the end of our program this evening, if that all suits you guys. So let me go through. As Gary mentioned, I worked as a Navy Maritime Reference Archivist at the National Archives from 2003 to 2018. And prior to that, I actually worked another 3 years pulling records for Army records for a while. And I did do a stint for a year and a half in the motion picture division. So I got a bit of experience in a few different offices there while I was at the National Archives. So moving on, let's see. So I am showing that my screen is sharing, and I'm trying to get it to play. Come on now. Oh, pardon everybody. Oh, there we go. Okay. I'm borrowing my daughter's computer today, so it's it's a little slow. That's all. First slide here. When we're talking about working with the National Archives or what the National Archives is, it's actually a pretty large organization, similar to the Coast Guard, in that there are many different missions under the National Archives umbrella. So when I think of the National Archives, I immediately think of Archives 1, because that's where I worked for so long. And it is the flagship building downtown in DC. But of course, there's also Archives 2 out in College Park. And in addition to having a lot of textual records, they also have the still pictures division out at College Park, as well as the motion picture and sound and video division where I worked, and a cartographic division. So any Coast Guard records that are under those kinds of records, whether it's still pictures, motion pictures, for the most part, are going to all be at Archives 2. Motion picture, sound, and video, those kinds of materials take special preservation. So those are all going to be out in College Park. Still pictures, you're talking if there are large runs of pictures of Coast Guard material, then they're going to be out at College Park. But that doesn't mean that there aren't also still pictures downtown. So you can find them both in both places. And cartographic division is also similar. If it's a small map or a small chart, it can be found downtown, but for the most part, they're going to be out at Archives 2 in College Park. Also within the National Archives family, we have the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis. Many of the cities across the country have field archives in which regional records are housed for regional research or out in the field archives. We also have federal record centers out in the field where records that have not yet been transferred to the National Archives sit in a warehouse until the records that are created by federal agencies are ready to be transferred finally to NARA. And sometimes that can take decades. Sometimes it just takes a matter of years, but oftentimes records will have to sit in a federal record center for a while, still under the legal authority of the agency that created them before they can be transferred over to the National Archives. Presidential libraries also fall under the umbrella. So we have presidential libraries starting with President Hoover all the way up to our current president. And any organization that calls themselves a presidential library prior to Hoover is not part of the National Archives system. I believe there's a Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library, but that predates 1928, so it is not part of the National Archives family. But also within NARA, we have the Federal Register, who is responsible for printing all the laws and the Code of Federal Regulations and all those kinds of printing activities. The National Archives is also responsible for administering the Electoral College. They also have an office called the National Historic Publications and Records Commission, which is the grant-making arm of the National Archives. And National Archives not only houses the records created by executive agencies in our federal government, but it also holds the records for the Center of Legislative Archives, which holds the records for the Senate and the House and different commissions like the 9/11 Commission. And it also has the Internal Security Oversight Office, which is ISOO. And there are many other offices that I haven't mentioned, but there are several offices that are part of National Archives that are beyond just what we think of when we're going to a repository to conduct our research. Right, and I know I'm probably speaking to a very well-seasoned and knowledgeable group. But sometimes when I was working at NARA, the questions came up about what was the difference between the National Archives and what was the difference between the Library of Congress. And so I just thought I'd delineate these rather quickly here. Most important to keep in mind is that National Archives is the repository for permanently valuable records created by the US government, whereas the Library of Congress generally is a recipient of course, it's a library of millions of books, but also keeps the private papers of individuals in their manuscript division. And they also have large repositories for photographs and cartographic and motion pictures and the like, just like the National Archives. But mostly those are items that have been created by personal individuals. Of course, there are exceptions. You will find federal government records at the Library of Congress, and there are personal records at the National Archives. So it's not a hard and fast. It's more of an art than a science. But those are generally the difference between the two. So moving on. So the National Archives itself wasn't created until 1934. And prior to creation of the National Archives, many of the permanently valuable records of the federal government were just kept in attics and basements, just like in my home. That's where I keep some of our important stuff, is tucked in a box somewhere in a closet. And so the federal government wasn't any different. And but it wasn't until I believe 1922 that the federal government started to get serious about creating an agency for the collection of important records for the federal government. And I believe that was with a fire in the Department of Commerce building. And so it was from 1922, I believe, is the year that Congress finally passed the first appropriation to start the process of analyzing what the needs were and how best to preserve the records of the federal government. So Archives 1 was the first building originally built back in the 1930s. And as an agency, the National Archives really got into its stride with World War II. As the War Department was gaining its footing and creating new records to support the war effort, they had to clear out space in their many different government buildings throughout Washington, D.C. And so all those records came to NARA just in the nick of time to so that they could empty out their space and make room for all the alphabet soup of federal government programs from the Great Depression, as well as supporting the war effort and our growth on the international stage. I just thought I'd throw this photograph in here. This is a photograph from the garage at the White House. And this is a collection of records of, I believe they were Confederate and Union compiled service records from the Civil War. And so this kind of gives you an idea of how some of the records were kept prior to the National Archives. So we've come a long way, and things have certainly gotten better from this time. I think my favorite part of the photo here is this tire over here in the corner. So I believe this was the White House garage in the 1930s.
Is there any significance to the tire?
Not to my knowledge, but I'll see what I can find out.
Just kidding.
So this is, I think I mentioned before that the National Archives, when it was built in the 30s, had a courtyard in the middle, just like any other federal government agency in downtown DC. And this is a unique shot within the courtyard before the stacks were filled in the 1940s to house all the records. In the 1930s, they hadn't yet done a survey of all the federal government agencies, so they really didn't have a handle as to how many records were going to be coming their way. And so they thought they could fit whatever records were going to be transferred to them within the shell of this building. And in the late 30s, they conducted a survey and they recognized that they didn't have enough space, lo and behold. And so now what we see at the archives in downtown DC is all the records that are stored there are stored where the courtyard used to be. And here, I believe this is a shot from the northwest corner looking southeast. And this here, this curved wall is the back of the rotunda where the charters of freedom are kept. And so all this open space was part of the courtyard, which is now closed stack space where all the records are kept. All right, so back to the topic at hand, a little bit about researching Coast Guard records at the National Archives. So much like the National Archives as a large umbrella organization, of course, so is the Coast Guard. And as you all know just as well as I do, that we are a merger of many different government agencies that came together over time, starting with the U.S. Revenue Marine, created in 1790. And then we have the U.S. Life Saving Service coming along in 1878. They merged in 1915 to form what we know now as the Coast Guard. And in 1939, the U.S. Lighthouse Service merged with the Coast Guard to as a financial saving measure in preparation for World War II. And also during World War II, we have the Bureau of Marine Inspection and Navigation merging with the Coast Guard. And so all these records are housed under Record Group 26. So all the records that are textual, that are in paper, that are not in any of the field archives, are at Archives 1. Of course, there are always exceptions, but for the most part, all of them are going to be at Archives 1, and that's where you're going to want to start your research. And of course, a couple of exceptions, some predecessor records for the Bureau of Marine Inspection and Navigation, also known as prior to that, it was the Steamship Inspection Service. Those records are in Record Group 41. And then there are also some Coast Guard or Revenue Marine, Revenue Cutter records that can be found with the records of the U.S. Customs House in Record Group 36. But for the most part, it's in Record Group 26. And moving right along, I just thought after that little bit of background, we could I could kind of drill down a little bit on a couple of cornerstones of Coast Guard research, and to show you a couple of tools that might be helpful. A couple of the cornerstones that people often would research when I was working at NARA would be the logbooks and the muster rolls. And while I've been at the Coast Guard Historian's Office, I've had the opportunity, while I'm the also wear the hat as the webmaster for the Coast Guard Historian's Office, I've been able to create a couple of tools that I hope will be helpful. So let me move on to those. Let me hit escape here. And I'm still sharing. I hope y'all can still see. And
We can.
okay, good. And let me get to here. We're just going to head over to the National Archives website. So that's just archives.gov, sure, as we all know. And so I'm sure here's a page that we're all familiar with. So research our records. You can go to, if you want to zero in on the Coast Guard logbooks that are available, you can go to this page, research our records. You can head down to research military records. And here we have the emblem for all of our armed services, and you can click on Coast Guard. And here's a great portal for getting started. And then if you click on this page, here we have vessel and station logbooks. So we have logbooks for U.S. Navy logs. As many of us know that the Coast Guard and Revenue Cutter Service fall under the U.S. Navy in times of war. And so you can sometimes find Coast Guard logbooks or muster rolls and some reports in Navy records. It's always worth a look. It might not be the place to start, but after you're going through your research, you may come to the point where you need to hop over to Navy records to see if you could find a report that might be of interest. Here we also have lighthouse stations, we have life-saving service, and here's the Coast Guard. So we could click on this. So here's a great synopsis of logbooks, of some information about logbooks available at the National Archives. And here are some of the lists actually that I had developed while I was working over there. So you can find Coast Guard station logs and see exactly what they have from 1915 to 41 without having to go on in person. And here's a list of logs and journals. That's kind of a miscellaneous potpourri of different items, but you can check that. We have some steam logs, some medical logs, telegraphic logs. One of the biggest projects that we took on was actually an item list of all the Coast Guard logbooks for World War II. So myself and another NARA colleague of mine, Kyle Jesse, was a stalwart assistant of mine for several years, and he went through every one of these boxes and handled all of these logbooks himself. He tested them, he checked them out to make sure that they were in good physical shape, and created these beautiful lists. Whereas before, it was someone would have to ask if you had a certain logbook for a certain vessel for a certain year, and we didn't have the list. But now all these lists are available and quite searchable. So once you get to a list that you're interested in, you can click on the 3 dots or whatever operating system you're using, do a search of the document, and you can immediately know which box your vessel or station or whatever it might be in. So that's one way that you can get at to know what the National Archives has. Also, you can click here for U.S. Revenue Cutter and Coast Guard. This is the largest series of logbooks for the Coast Guard. And if you click on this identifier number 585454, this will kick you over to the National Archives catalog. And this gives you a good list of what records are available online. So you can conduct a search. And so here it gives you a list of all the logbooks that are available online through the catalog for the Coast Guard for that run from 1820 to 1941. And let's see, I think we have, what did it say? We have 1,100 file units just of these logbooks alone. So you might notice as going through a lot of these vessel names that there's a lot of Arctic history here. When we digitized logbooks at the National Archives, we worked in concert with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, because they were interested in capturing all the weather data in the deck logs. And they wanted to start off with all the logbooks for any vessel that transited the Arctic Circle. So a lot of the logbooks that have been digitized and are available this way are all vessels. I think we got through 95% of them, of all the logbooks that had transited the Arctic at any time during its history. And we went ahead and imaged the entire run, no matter where the vessel was at that time. So we imaged all the logbooks for that history. So you have logbooks available for their voyages all across the world. All right. And let me kick over. So that's one way you can research logbooks over at NARA. I'd also like to take a moment and head over to Coast Guard Historian's website. We have a couple of tools. Let me just here. So if you go to history, uscg.mil. And there we are. So here's our website. And for those of you who may not have been to our website before, if you come over to research, you can click on finding aids. And here we have a page of digitized deck logs at NARA. And so coming up will be another handful of ways that you can access whatever logbooks have been digitized at NARA through our website. So here's kind of some background information that I mentioned about our collaboration with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Here's a list of all the logbooks that we have that have been digitized. And you can hear all the links. So you can just link directly to whatever vessel you might be interested in for the time frame that you're interested in. And so here we can go to Bear. And if we click here, we can go on to the period between 1897 and 1898. And so here we are. Let's see, why don't we go to, let's see, why don't we just pick frame 30. We'll see what comes up. So this, I believe, is entry from December 16th, 1897. And here we have the entry here. Yeah, here, partly cloudy and hazy, stiff to fresh, southeasterly winds. So here's Lieutenant Jarvis went ashore, finding it practicable to load the expedition at 10:30. Landing in stages and an outfit. Lieutenant Jarvis, Lieutenant Berthoff, and Surgeon Call left the vessel. And so you can see that this is documenting the overland expedition of 1897. And so one of the great moments in Coast Guard history when Lieutenant Jarvis and his crew marched thousands of miles through Alaska to reach the trapped whalers up in the Arctic Circle. So that's another way you can access Coast Guard logbooks. I'd also like to show you a way. Let's see if we go back to history. uscg.mil. So we go back to our website. Again, you can go to research and then finding aids, and you can come down here, and here's a good synopsis of muster rolls. So here we have a list of muster rolls. So this is a series of muster rolls that are bound volumes. And so you have a list here of all the bound volumes that are available at NARA. You have the date span of each volume that's available. And then it also gives you the volume number. So if you need to go over to the National Archives and call these up to look at them, then you have all the information you need to call them up in the Central Research Room. So here's our muster rolls. You get 65 volumes of those. Here's another run of payrolls for revenue cutter and Coast Guard vessels. And going back, we also have unbound muster rolls, so 158 boxes of material. We have some shipping articles in 30 volumes, also providing good crew lists for different vessels and stations. And then my favorite one is this one. So this is the muster rolls for the US Coast Guard for World War II and later. And we can click on that. So you get a bit of a background explanation here. And again, you have a very complete list of all the vessels, for each year, and then all the stations, all the numbered vessels. And again, you can just, depending on your operating system, you can do a search by term for any of these vessels or stations. For any of those muster rolls between 1941 and 1949. And so that's some of the things that I've been working on with the website to try to make it easier to access some of these important records and Coast Guard holdings over at the National Archives. So with that, I think, yeah, it's 7:30. I think I'll leave it there. and maybe open it up to a little bit of question and answer if anybody has a question you'd like to ask.
All right, well, first of all, thank you very much, Mark. That was very helpful information. I also want to give you credit as a historian. You did great with technology. Historians traditionally have a problem with technology for our presentations, so that was great. Before we go into questions, though, I wanted to add one other resource section, and that is the Coast Guard Academy Library has what's known as their special collections. And Alyssa Graydon, who runs that, was not able to be here tonight to give some information. So I'm going to read what she asked us to present. And that is, United States Coast Guard Academy Library maintains a growing collection of United States Coast Guard and United States Coast Guard Academy materials to support research of cadets and faculty, provide the cadets a connection to the history and traditions of their service. Special collections archive material are available for use by the Coast Guard community, cadets, faculty, and staff of the United States Coast Guard Academy and other researchers upon request. And if you go to the Coast Guard Library or Coast Guard Academy Library website, you'll have all the links for that. One very interesting resource they have there is what was known as Coast Guard Magazine. In years past, that would have been Commandant's Bulletin and some other things. It's varied over time. It goes back to the 20s. It is an amazing little time capsule of what was important to the Coast Guard at the time. If you look at 1940, you can see the Coast Guard already starting to build up to World War II when that wasn't even a thought for most people. So it's a really neat little tool to go up there. She is wonderfully helpful, and I just wanted to give her a plug too before everybody left the meeting. Also, we have Master Chief Bill Dietz online with us, who has done a lot of work in the archives. So if we have some questions about practical things, Bill will be able to answer some questions too, along with Mark. If you've never gone into the archives and we're done what's called a draw, and you get a box delivered to you, I equate it to sort of like Christmas parties at the office. You really have no idea whether you're going to get a great gift or a terrible gift, because many of those boxes are filled with things that are dependent on what that office, what that ship thought was important to send off. There are required things, but then there's other things that get thrown in there. I mean, I've seen purchase requests for detergent in a book. So it's very interesting what you can get. Oftentimes you'll get things that are handwritten, and as you saw from some of the logs from the 1800s, they can be very difficult to read. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and open up to questions. Everybody should be able to unmute yourself. We have been well behaved in the past, so go ahead and try not to step on each other, but go ahead and start asking your questions. Somebody's got to have a question. Greg, you are still muted.
Yeah. Okay. Being a person, that can't stand silence, kind of thing. So, one of the things I've just a thought process when I was looking at some of the regional archives. When I was the CEO of the International Ice Patrol, because the Ice Patrol has been around since 1914, there were things that were required to send to the thing. And as I remember it, and again, I had my competent YN1 sending all this stuff off from season to season, but I believe it went to Boston. So Mark, how does one, like, when you're looking for something that may have gotten sent to a regional archive, is there any kind of a process to figure out which regional archive it may have gone to?
Yeah, very good question. Regional archives are generally hold the records for the Coast Guard stations of that region. And then also it's dependent on the home port of the vessel. So it should have been somewhere in, since you were on the Ice Patrol. And so the closest Federal Record Center to that activity would have been in Boston, I assume.
Yes.
And so those records came to the FRC in Waltham, Massachusetts, where they sat and aged for a period of time before they were transferred over to the reference services at the archival facility there.
Yeah, it was a challenge for us a little bit because I mean, at that point we were stationed in Groton, Connecticut, so it was going to Boston. But when I would go back and look for previous records, at one point it had been in Governor's Island, New York, so the records were in New York, you know, so that kind of thing. And you know, prior to the war, I mean, you know, who knew where they were? So fortunately, we had retained a lot of records ourselves, so that helped. But
Yeah, indeed. And that does bring up a point. So speaking about the logbooks, you know, generally those logbooks are located at Archives 1 up until 1970 or 72. So while I was at the Naval History and Heritage Command, I had the opportunity to work with our friends at the Veterans Benefits Administration to help digitize the Navy logbooks over at NARA. And then during that project, they realized that the Coast Guard was also in Vietnam. And so they went ahead and digitized all the Coast Guard logbooks for the 1960 to 72 period as well. So all those are available online, whether it's a station or logbook or a vessel logbook or what have you, whether it was in Vietnam or not, which is terrific of them to digitize all of them. But after that 1970 to 72 cutoff, the logbooks are available in the federal record centers in the reference field archives based on the home port of the vessel or the location of the station. So if you're interested in logbooks from say 1970, 72 to somewhere in the 1990s, then those are going to be available in the field archives throughout the country. And even then, it's good to cast a wide net, because especially in New England, you have so many that are close together that you have some that are sharing responsibilities. So you have sometime in the aughts, I believe it was, the field archives in New York moved from Varick Street to the old Customs House building, and they lost a lot of space. And so what they did is they sent a lot of their records down to Philadelphia. So New York regional New York regional records can also be accessed in the Philadelphia region. So you can have a choice of whether to access them in Philadelphia, or you can have them shipped from Philadelphia up to New York. But you have to give yourself a couple of days, because there's a lot of records that they have to order, and it takes at least 24, 48 hours to get them from Philly up to New York, if that's where you want to see them. And I also had heard some rumors that the National Archives was trying to close the Seattle branch of the field archives. And the latest thing I heard is that they are not going to be closing the Seattle field archives, but that it is due for pretty large overhaul of renovation. And so a lot of people aren't working on site because there's a lot of work that needs to be done to the building. I think it's a GSA building, it's old, it needs to be renovated. And so people may not be working on site, so records may not be accessible at the moment, but they're preparing for, I believe, a renovative overhaul of the facility.
All right, Greg, you have your hand raised.
Yes, for those that don't know me, I know many of you. Greg Ketchen, I'm up at the Coast Guard Heritage Museum in Cape Cod. Little advertisement, love to get an interview up there. Obviously, we learned from others. We've been just approaching our 20th year in existence. But my question for you, Mark, is we have an extensive archive there, a lot of records. How do we get those incorporated in? I know if you're familiar with the initiative called Digital Commonwealth, and we've been sending many of our records up to the BPL, Boston Public Library, that has a grant from the state to digitize, whether it's charts or photographs or logs, and they've digitized it, and it's fantastic. The equipment they have there is phenomenal. But all of it's online now. My question is how that can be incorporated into the National Archives. This is invaluable information. One example I'll give is we have a diary from World War II from a guy named DeRosia. He was on an LSD in Guam or actually, he was on the landing when the Marines were raising a flag up on Mount Suribachi, and he documented that in his diary. And in the diary, it indicates that he was the one that made the flagpole that was used for raising the flag with the Marines. We know a lot about the flag. We know a lot about the people that are involved. We didn't know that this person made the flagpole. That should be something that's in the National Archive, I would suspect. We have actually the diary in possession. So Mark, I'd love to get you up to the museum and show some of the stuff there, but there are so many issues that we have that in common. In fact, Gary and I are now working on an initiative called the National Coast Guard Museum Network. And all of us are linked, including Fred Herzberg out in Seattle, the various museums around the country. And so we can share this information through Past Perfect, which is a piece of software that most museums have all the information of what they have in our archive. And we can share information to, if we're doing an exhibit, as we're going to be doing one in by a year and a half on icebreakers, when a new Polar Security Cutter comes out, we're gonna have a new exhibit there. And we're now working on the exhibit design, and we're talking to other museums about what they have that we can show in our museum. But back to you, Mark. The question is, how do we share this information with the archive and get that out of, for example, Digital Commonwealth database?
That's a great question. I know there are a lot of records out there in the field that either have left federal government service or repositories that are wound up in private hands, or terrific pieces of documentation that have been created by individuals who took their diaries with them and need to be made available. And that's a fantastic initiative. But as far as answering your question, I don't know. The National Archives has their own museum, and there are plenty of initiatives to reach out to other facilities. But right now, I think their focus is internal. They've got their own operations. They've got their own limited budget. They've got so much material that they still need to digitize in-house. And that seems to be the focus of their efforts now. But it seems like there's a lot of fertile ground for maritime institutions to share, as you mentioned, with Past Perfect and other programs and our websites and the like. To share more information about what it is other institutions have. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there. But as far as the diary goes, that would be a personal item of that individual. And so it wouldn't necessarily perhaps be a government record. And so might not be something that would be transferred to the National Archives. But certainly there's a lot of great material out there that people can learn about and should be pointed to your holdings in your institution. But I really don't have an answer for you.
Things like on oral histories, for example, those aren't official documents, but for example, Fred Herzberg and Gary's been working on it too. There's a large inventory of oral histories coming up, but where those can be accessed in a central repository is invaluable. Stories of, we have so many that have come up. Are there those of interest to the archive or not? Oral histories?
Not the National Archives, no. The Library of Congress has a terrific program for oral histories. And also, we also at the Coast Guard Historian's Office have our own oral history program. And so a lot of institutions have smaller programs going on. But usually the National Archives was not a repository for oral histories.
Let me just one last comment. Cape Cod's a nice place to visit. Welcome, opportunity if you come up. Maybe you can get an excuse to come up to Cape Cod, because I'd love to brainstorm with you, spend a day or so with you, showing what we have and some ideas of how we can incorporate. The goal is to have this information accessible to a much larger audience than it is.
Yeah.
Whether it's a high school student in Guam that's doing a paper on lightships, for example, that they can access our information. And we're getting there, but we're still quite a ways away from there. And you may have some ideas to help you, along with what's available in the archive, National Archive, combination of all those records. We often get people who come into the museum, visitors, that want to know about their ancestors that served in a merchant marine or served on a Coast Guard cutter in the 30s or 40s. And it's good to see what you just went through there. At least I have a little bit better information I can get to them to see if we can track down some of their history. This goes along with a lot of ancestry initiatives that people are going through now.
Sure. Well, I don't need any more reasons to come up to Cape Cod. I would love to come up anytime. And now I have another reason. So, so there are a couple of Coast Guard stations I need to visit up there that way. Anyway, so I'd certainly looking forward to dropping by your museum.
Well, it's the birthplace of the Coast Guard, as it turns out.
Yeah, yeah.
So a good place to visit.
Absolutely.
All right, if I could ask Bill Dietz to just give us a minute or two about your experience of doing it, you know, from simple to where's parking, how do I get draws done, those kind of things that are practical. You're still on mute, Bill. There you go.
Okay. Good evening, Mark. Great presentation. Great seeing you again. As you know, I have visited the archives a few times, number between 8 and 10. I've been to Archives 1, Archives 2, and Boston. And every one of them is different in the sense of pulling and getting the material, everything else. So having said that, the way I do it is I go on the catalog and I research my topic, and then I make a list. Then I email through Contact Us, and someone replies to me. And then I set up an appointment. The archives is fun, but we all have created some of the documents, and you see them. But we must remember that the documents are their personal property, not ours. So we have to follow the rules. And prior to going into the archives, need to take a little quiz, watch a couple videos on the care, the policies, and then you take a multiple choice test, and it gets logged now by internet, and then you get your certificate, and then you go up to wherever you're going, and they will give you a badge. It's paper now. It's not even plastic. No food, no drinks. Can bring scanners, cameras, scanners or a flatbed. They cannot be any kind of mechanism like a printer or whatever. Cameras you can, no flash, no lights, and just you're a guest in their building. I enjoy it. I've had very good experiences with it. Now, Mark, are they going to digitize the muster rolls and logbooks prior to 1960?
All right. Good question. They have done some digitization of Coast Guard logbooks prior to 1960. As you note, they're not completely done. But that imaging project with National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration does continue. One of the challenges that they found with imaging Coast Guard logbooks is, one, the vessels were smaller. And so it was much more apt that a logbook might get wet.
Mhm.
And so a logbook might be stuck in a box for decades before anybody actually picks it out of the box to look at it. And lo and behold, you might find that it's got mold on it. And so you've got some preservation issues more with Coast Guard logbooks or revenue cutter logbooks than you do with Navy logbooks. And another issue with imaging Coast Guard or revenue cutter logbooks is that there are many different formats. So you've got single sheets, you've got bound volumes, you have bound volumes that look like Navy deck logs with the weather and the how much coal was being consumed and the chart with all that interesting information on the left, and then the operations page on the right. But then you also have transcripts that are single paged or bound at the top. And so you have much more variety of the type of log with the revenue cutter, which provides another challenge to imaging all of them. I'm hopeful someday that they will. We're working with some individuals in the Coast Guard Auxiliary to continue with imaging revenue marine and revenue cutter logbooks from the Civil War era, with hopes that we would be able to post those to our website. So I'll let you know how that progresses. But there are a number of challenges there with imaging Coast Guard and revenue cutter logbooks that aren't such a challenge with the Navy. And so the impetus at first is to do the Navy. And so we're seeing more progress in that regard. The muster rolls is another issue. When I was working at NARA, one of the most highly sought after items was the muster rolls for the Civil War Army. And it was unfortunately the case that those could never be made available to the public just because they were on such cheap paper and they were in such brittle condition. You saw the photograph of the records from the White House garage. And so you have these records that were on poor quality paper, might not have been stored in the best conditions before coming to the National Archives. And so they were very brittle and we couldn't make those available. And so it provides another hurdle for making other muster rolls available, because if you make those available, then more pressure would be put to make the Army muster rolls available. And so also you run into the same issue with Coast Guard muster rolls, and that there are so many different formats and there's so many different sizes that in order to put together a large project of imaging for such a project, it just provides so many hurdles to smooth operation. Whereas with the Navy records, it's usually a single format and you can get a very speedy process going. So you can make more headway working with Navy muster rolls than you can with Coast Guard muster rolls, unfortunately. One example though is that working with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, they did image all of the Navy muster rolls from 1861 to 1879. And they were able to image those in about 4 or 5 months. And those have all been put up and are available online. And actually there are 3 to 5 revenue cutters that are also available in that run, including the revenue cutter Harriet Lane, and I believe another one named Hope. And there was the Howell Cobb, I think, is also available. And so, so long story even longer, there's just a lot of challenges when it comes to imaging Coast Guard records. Right now, the focus tends to be towards Navy logbooks and Navy muster rolls.
Thank you, Bill, for your offering that experience. I want to ask Mark a question of something that's similar related to it, and it's a service that I've taken partake of. We have a question in the chat is, are there professionals that you can hire to go in and do research for you? And I know in the past I had done that when I was in Hawaii. Candace would go in and pull records for me. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Oftentimes we would get scores of requests being on the reference staff through email or letters or what have you. And oftentimes the staff, when they receive a request, there's kind of an unmentioned rule that you give a request like that about an hour of time before you have to move on to somebody else. So if you can answer somebody's question within an hour and maybe find a page or two and copy them and make them available and answer someone's question, then perhaps somebody on staff would go ahead and go to that effort to satisfy that request, or at least I did when I was working there. But then sometimes you get requests of a larger nature and you can't possibly tackle that in an hour as a staff member. And so what you can do is offer individuals who can't come on site to do research to hire someone to come on site and do that research for you. And you mentioned Candace Clifford. She was wonderful to work with. I worked with her for years. So if you go to the National Archives website, I believe somewhere in Archives 1, it would take me a while to find it. There is a list of researchers for hire. And I believe there's also a similar list over at the Library of Congress of individuals who either live locally in Washington, D.C. or in the field archives out in the across the country, or individuals who know how to make their way through ordering official military personnel files in St. Louis at the National Personnel Records Center. So there are people out there who are adept at doing research for hire for individuals who can't make it to these facilities. And so if you can drill down to the research facility that you know your records are located, and you can search their website and find such a list of individuals.
All right, who else has a question?
Oh, that was too easy. I have to say something. Hey, I would like to put a plug in. Mark talked about it a little bit when you go to the historian's website. You know, if you're not looking for originals, or in addition to looking for original source documentation like, you know, cutter logs or whatever, on their historic documents section, there's just a whole wealth of stuff that's been, you know, accumulated and digitized. And you know, I think Mark is responsible for a bunch of that. So.
Yeah, when I started at the National Archives back in 2000, or when I started working with Navy Maritime Records, it was a terrific opportunity for me because, tell you the truth, I don't think I could have told anyone the difference between the Marine Corps and the Merchant Marine at the time. But it was a terrific opportunity to learn. I didn't know much about ships. I didn't know boats. I had a master's in history. And they just plunged me into the deep end. And I just really thoroughly enjoyed learning as much as I could. Learned about the Navy and the War Shipping Administration and so many different agencies. And my favorite records to work with was always the Coast Guard records, because it's just not only being the oldest maritime service in the United States history, but to work with the different records at different times and experience kind of its growth as an international institution, and the breadth and depth of all the missions. It's just, there's so much rich documentation there to work with. And the Coast Guard was everywhere all the time. So it was always a pleasure to work with those records, and I'm very grateful to be working at the Coast Guard Historian's Office now.
And the Coast Guard remains everywhere all the time as it is now. Greg, you have your hand up. I'll go with you for the last question.
Yeah, and unfortunately, Mark, this isn't for you. It's just a comment to Bob. Early in my career, I was the deputy at the International Ice Patrol under Staff Oceanographer while I was on Governor's Island. Love to talk to you a little bit at some point about that history. So at some point, maybe we can talk on the phone about the Ice Patrol. We have a new exhibit on Ice Patrol in our museum. It's going to be up for another year.
Yeah, I would love to see it. One of the greatest things for a history geek like me was as CEO of the Ice Patrol, where they've kept all the logs all the way back, a copy of the logs all the way back to the beginning. And so just to hold a log that Iceberg Smith drew hand drawings of icebergs and plotted that. I mean, they've done a really nice job of preserving the history. So yeah, love to talk to you. Probably my favorite tour out of a very diverse and interesting career. So yeah, good stuff. But I also like to put a plug in for everybody who's like, when you're looking for, non-original source or some original source documentation, and you're getting ready to start researching something, go to the Coast Guard Historian's Office, look at their historical documents section. It's really, there's just a wealth of information there. So yeah, just putting a plug in for the Historian's Office. So, yep.
All right, with that, I'm going to offer a couple comments. Mark, one of the things I have found, my research right now is in World War II area, is to keep in mind that there may be Coast Guard records in places other than Record Group 26.
Yep.
So during World War II, when we operated under the Navy, I think the two other record groups for Navy operations and CNO are 24 and 38. You can look there. I'm currently doing research on the FS ships that the Coast Guard operated for the Army. I think Mr. Roberts kind of thing. And so I'm having to go into Army record groups to try and find records. So when you're looking at record groups, don't just go with 26 and that's the end of the story. There are other places you might find Coast Guard information. And to the question about hiring a researcher, I strongly recommend is that when you look at doing that is you talk to the person you're looking at. They all have a little bit of niches and specialties in what they're used to. I used Candace because she knew everything about lighthouse records, but she may not have been the perfect person for other parts of the Coast Guard. So each of them has a little bit of a specialty and experience. And when you meet with them, make sure you are very clear on what you're looking for. Just going and saying, pull all the records you have is just not a reasonable request. And once you talk with them, they'll understand that a little bit. So with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up tonight. I see Scott Price has been on. I'll give you a chance to say something if you want to, Scott.
Can everybody hear me?
We can.
Okay. Well, Mark, put in your TDY request. We'll send you up to Cape Cod.
All right.
And we're happy to have you on board and happy with what you've done and nice work. And I love the plug to Candace. I think we all miss her. And I still can't get over that, but well done. And one thing too that some of the folks have talked about, that's why we are here, is the Coast Guard Historian's Office. We can help tell folks who has what. So if you're interested in doing Coast Guard history, and you might find something that might be at the Coast Guard Heritage Museum about the diary we just heard about, we can be that cornerstone or that centralized communication area where we know who has what, and we can work from there. And that's kind of what we're doing. And we're so glad to have Mark on board, and well done, young man.
All right, thanks, Scott. All right, so with that, we're going to go ahead and close out. Again, Mark, thank you very much for this presentation. We had a little bit of a pause in doing these. We're now back on to monthly. It's typically the Tuesday, the first full week in a month, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Monitor our Facebook. And I will continue to send out the emails for those people who prefer emails over social media. But with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up. If I could just have Bob hang on at the end for some admin stuff. Greg, if you could hold too. And with that, thanks everyone and have a good rest of your evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Maybe.